Welcome back to the Tomb, everyone. This is the Pharaoh, aka Ali. And for today's episode, it is called My Community, My Rights. And I have a very important guest with me today, and I'll have her go ahead and introduce herself.
Well, thank you for having me, Ashanti. My name is Crystal James, and I am a public health trained attorney, and that is currently practicing as a faculty member at Tuskegee University. Previous to coming to Tuskegee, I had a private practice where I did mostly labor and employment law, and also a public health consulting firm where I worked with a lot of different agencies doing program evaluation, program development, and other consulting roles inside of institutions of higher learning, as well as in K through 12 institutions. So thank you for having me.
No problem. And I definitely wanted to have you on, especially since everything that's been going on in the past year and a half with public health getting more attention than normal. I feel like when people hear about public health, is only when things go wrong. When it goes right, people really don't talk that much about public health. And especially with the pandemic and public health and people asserting their rights, I wanted to sit down and have a conversation with you about that, because when people start talking about rights, it's in the legal aspect of it. So I wanted to ask you, could you explain the intersection between public health and law?
Absolutely. Well, first of all, I like to start by saying any ideas or opinions that I express here today are my own and don't necessarily reflect the position or opinions of the institution that I work at right now, which is Tuskegee University. But the intersection of public health and law is basically it is built on the basis of police powers. And when I say police powers, I'm not talking about the police officers that you see that are there to protect the community from crime. I'm talking about the ability or the authority for a governmental body to regulate for the general welfare of the population. And they're basically all of that authority rests with the states under the state sovereignty clause, because it is not explicitly given to the federal government, then it is reserved to the states. And that is why, especially during this pandemic, you saw at the critical beginning aspects, you saw each of the governors declare a state of emergency, which allowed the federal government an opportunity to provide resources to them for the benefit of the population that was in the boundary of those states. States have derived their rights derived the laws under public health, usually through the judicial process. There are very few states, at least prior to the early 2000s, that had specific public health laws that were in a chapter that specifically dealt only with public health. Usually you had health measures that came in under either the regulation of healthcare providers, or you had health policies that were related to institutions that had large groups of people housed together, like schools or prisons or disability facilities, mm-hmm. or long-term care facilities. And so
would research also like clinical research and things like that fall underneath like the judicial branch?
Well, actually, what has happened in the evolution of the laws for protections of human subject has come from the actual case law or stare decisis, where they use how cases have been decided before. And most pivotal to that was in the U.S. Public Health Service study of untreated syphilis in a Negro male. One of the most important things that came out of that study was the actual adoption of standards and guidelines for human subjects research. So while it came out an atrocity, which ended up in a lawsuit, it actually was the promulgation of the group of rules and regulations under the Department of Health and Human Services that now govern that process.
Okay. And I know that you talked about police power. And so for those who don't know, Attorney James was also my teacher. So in our class, I think it was public health and law, we talked about the Jacobson versus Massachusetts case. Could you explain what that is and how police power came out of that?
Absolutely. Henning Jacobson was a plaintiff against the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, and this is a case that dates back to 1904, when the argument was made before the U.S. Supreme Court that actually sought to invalidate a state law that mandated vaccinations for individuals who resided in that state. Jacobson felt like he did not want to be vaccinated, and he was, by the lower courts, found to be in violation of the law and imposed a fine of $5. The vaccination was for smallpox, and it had been determined by the Commonwealth of Massachusetts that it was in the interest of public safety and necessary for public health and safety that all individuals are required to be vaccinated and revaccinated when that became available and applicable based upon medical recommendations. So anyone over the age of 21 had to actually comply with this rule. And when Jacobson refused, he was detained, he was fined, and he then brought lawsuit against the state to try to declare that this violated his constitutional rights under the 14th Amendment of the Constitution, and stating that no state should be able to make or enforce any law to abridge the privileges and immunities of citizens of the United States, or deprive person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. Mm-hmm. And the court found that his argument was not successful, and they refused to uphold that as a legitimate argument to keep him from being compelled to be vaccinated. This is still good law in the United States today. It is still referenced when we talk about compulsory vaccination or vaccination mandates throughout this United States.
Yes, and it's interesting how because that was 1904, correct?
Yes.
So these same arguments are kind of still happening today, because correct me if I'm wrong, is that it wasn't also part of his argument was that the vaccine would have been harmful to him, and that's why he elected not to take it?
Yes, he did use as a part of his argument that he had it was medically a problem for him to take this vaccination. And part of what came out of this case is the medical exemption, and it set out the actual individual elements that you have to establish in order to have a legitimate medical exception. And the court did not find that his argument on its own, without a expert testimony of a physician to support his position, that he could be successful in this particular argument. But it did, in the dicta, or part of the language of the explanation of how the court got this decision, did accept that a medical exception is appropriate, but it does have to have the appropriate predicate or the appropriate foundation.
Okay. And so you said that it was medical exemption, and then if I'm not mistaken, isn't there also a religious exemption as well?
Absolutely, there is a religious, and what the court deemed as a sincerely held religious exemption to having a vaccination could be accepted. And again, it would have to be shown through the tenets of the religion, not just I'm religious and I think it's against my religion. You have to be able to show in doctrine that that particular religion actually holds this position that you are asserting to the court, and that it has to be evidence to prove that. And that is usually through a minister that has been ordained in that particular religion, who would then have to stipulate for the record, either in writing or through testimony, that that is a part of the religious tenet in order for you to be successful using a sincerely held religious objection.
Okay, so you can't just say that, oh, I'm a Christian scientist and we don't believe in modern medicine, or would Amish people fall underneath that category as well if they didn't want to get vaccinated?
I can't say that I know Amish doctrine well enough to answer that with any authority. But again, it would have to be doctrine that's either written in their canons and or their religious texts that can be clearly pointed to as accepted over time, or have a religious leader that is willing to accept and to stipulate in writing that this is a canon of a belief of the religion as a whole. It can't just be a particular sect or this one church is saying we don't believe this is good. It has to actually be a doctrine of the entire religion. So if you're Baptist, it can't just be this one, Baptist church down on the corner that believes it. It has to be the entire Baptist people who are believing that in that denomination is a part of their canons.
Okay. So, and this holds true for religions that are, I guess, would be deemed as they're recognized by the United States.
Absolutely.
So you can't necessarily just make up a religion and say part of the tenets are this. Like, it has to be an established religion.
Absolutely. So you can't just go create a little church on your own, which you can do, but it has to be affiliated with an accepted religious group or a faith that has been recognized by somebody other than yourself that enables you to use that exemption. Okay.
So from that case, that's where the police power was established. Are there any other powers that the local, state, or federal government has to enforce public health regulations or laws?
Absolutely. Although they're not necessarily couched as police powers, through employers, through setting rules and policies for employment, actually many times do get into the area of regulating for the general welfare of their employees. I.e., if they have a policy that, if you're sick, you should not come into work, and you have you have to actually have a certain type of excuse from a doctor in order for you to get paid for your sick leave. That is a health related or public health related rule, because they don't want you to come in and make other people sick. That is the intent behind the rule. But it actually operates to either mandate or compel certain behaviors if you want to be employed by that employer. Okay. You also have other types of organizations that if you want to be affiliated with them, they may have certain rules about how you are to conduct yourself, which could include things that you eat, things that you refrain from, like drinking or smoking, that are canons in a part of that faith or that group, that if you want to be a member, that you have to agree to abide by. So you have other ways in which the health of subpopulations can be regulated that go beyond the state and federal police powers. And I do want to stipulate that the federal government, in order for them to actually operationalize their police powers, it has to be through either an invitation from the state to assist, or they actually get involved in regulating health and welfare, usually through the ability to tax and spend. That is, i.e., they collect our tax dollars. And in order for you to receive federal block grants for certain services, you have to agree to provide certain services or to prohibit certain activities in order to be able to participate in that block grant program. And
was that the tactic with when excuse me, when they rolled out Medicare, Medicare, Medicare,
Medicaid.
Medicaid. Oh, it always. I'm gonna get this right one of these days. Medicaid. When they rolled out Medicaid, because it was left up to the states that if they were going to enroll in it or not. So was that one of the tactics that was used, that like if you do this, then you'll get this block of money?
Absolutely. It is through the power to tax and spend that a lot of the expansion of Medicaid has happened. And in order for states to get resources to provide the Medicaid services that they want to, they had to agree to also provide other services. And so you do have some states that have opted out, like the state of Alabama, of the Medicaid expansion because of their unwillingness to provide or inability to provide the services that are attached to them.
Okay. And as we talk about this, I kind of wanted to ask you about how was it established that the federal government doesn't have a say in like public health of its citizens, like with the state? I guess it's the states' rights type of thing. And I think as us as Black people, usually when they say states' rights, we kind of know what they're trying to do.
Well, this dates back to the founding fathers, if you will, and the formulation of the Constitution. At the time that the Constitution was written, or any time any new law is written, you can never contemplate all the different things that might come up at some later date. Mm-hmm. And so the framers of the Constitution were dealing with the prevailing issues of the time. And what they did put in there, because of them trying to bring together these different sovereign states into one union, they agreed anything that was not explicitly covered in the Constitution, i.e. there has to be a direct provision that speaks directly to that issue. If it is not within the four corners of the Constitution, then by default, it is left to the states.
Okay.
And health was not contemplated at that time.
And I guess that's the thing with interpretation, because I believe it might have been in your class. It might have been in either your class or in Intro to Public Health, that we talked about how within the Constitution, some people have tried to define, I think where it says like the welfare of the either state or union is left to the federal government, and people have tried to interpret that as kind of meaning public health, like public health fits into welfare.
Oh, absolutely. There have been attempts to expand the scope of the federal government into other areas for many different reasons, commerce, for economic reasons, and other things. But what the Supreme Court's job is to interpret, well, one of them is to interpret the Constitution and to actually offer opinion as to whether or not the Constitution is silent on an issue, or how it should, the words should be interpreted, looking at what we call, again, precedent, how cases have been decided year over year. So just because we get a new court, they are still bound by how decisions have been made in the past. And that's why you can have a case like Jacobson versus Massachusetts still be good law now, because there has not been a case that has been brought before the Supreme Court that has compelled them to, either through such a change in society or such a change in medicine or such a change in the will of the people, that it should be overturned, and we should have a new understanding of who has the authority to regulate in that area. Now, it can happen. It has happened in our history before. It has not happened in the issue of health and healthcare. And the one instance that we can point to where it happened before, again, is when you look at civil rights, especially in education, when you look at cases like Plessy versus Ferguson and Brown versus the Board of Education. Prior to Brown versus the Board of Education, all of the cases had all decided consistently that separate but equal was more than fair. But it took a change in the will of the people and a groundswell in the change of society to actually compel the court to make a decision against an earlier Supreme Court decision. So it can happen, but it's very rare.
Okay. And I think with the Jacobson, well, what came out of the Jacobson versus Massachusetts case is that they added exemptions so that even within what he was saying, it's like, okay, we don't necessarily believe what you're saying on this, but someone could make this argument. So we're going to bake in certain exemptions so that it kind of leaves the door open so that you can't say like, oh, you don't have the power to do this. Like we do. In your case, you are exempt from this power that we have.
Right.
So that's very interesting. So I wanted to talk to you about the pandemic, I'll say the dirty word COVID. Everyone tries to stay away from when you're posting things on the internet. If you say COVID, you get flagged for everything. So I kind of wanted to talk to you about the COVID pandemic and how it highlighted the tension between individual rights and public rights.
Yes, I think we're seeing that continue to play out as we see the president has issued his action plan for the elimination of COVID in our communities, or the mitigation of COVID in our communities. And a part of that is compulsory vaccination mandates that for federal employees as well as federal contractors, which many people don't understand. Federal contractors reach a large sector of the United States, especially those in the higher education and K through 12 education systems. And so the analysis of how that will be adopted as we close in on the December 8th date will be interesting to see how and if that is challenged by states or individuals in regards to its application to them personally. But it is the tension between individual rights and the right for a law to be put in place to protect the entire community is kind of what Jacobson versus Massachusetts centers on, and what it has set and what has been good law in this country since 1904 is if there's a compelling reason that in communicable diseases where you have the ability to, just by going about your daily business, impact someone else's individual rights, then that's when the state or federal government in this instance has the right to then detract from your ability to actualize your individual rights for the greater good of the whole population. And restated a different way is that your individual rights end where mine begin. So you have a right to do what you want to do with your own person, as long as you do not then impact me as an individual. And communicable disease situations and compulsory vaccinations have been analyzed time and time again to be a space where people may be compelled to do something individually, i.e. take a vaccination that they may not want to do because it's in the best interest of the general population.
Okay. And I think to sorry, I don't know what's going on with me today. To an extent, I do agree with that. I think that where I find some contention with it is that it only seems to, in the society, it only seems to be in the case of infectious diseases. Like people will say like the promotion that's been going around is that you need to get vaccinated because you need to care about people in your community and you need to help those in your community, keep them safe, keep them healthy, everything like that. It's like, okay, I can understand that. I can get behind that if that was consistent across the board. Because one thing that what I talk to people is that if we really care about people within our community, making sure that they're healthy, then there's no reason why a insulin shot should cost upwards to $800. Because if we're really talking about caring for people, then it is pretty much a toss-up for some people if they contract COVID, how their symptoms are going to progress. Does a vaccine work? Yes. So it does work, but it is a toss-up. If I get it, I don't know how I'm going to react. However, if I'm a diabetic and I take insulin injections, if I can't afford my insulin, I will die. Like that's not necessarily a toss-up in the air. So I think I find it interesting that it's that type of tactic has been used to entice or coerce people into getting vaccinated, but it's not consistent across the board.
I think your question or your comment strikes upon an issue that is problematic in public health as a whole. We tend to regard those illnesses that we believe are caused by behaviors that you created yourself versus something that someone else do that impacts you.
Mm-hmm.
So for even when you talk about the infectious disease, HIV and AIDS, even when you speak about that disease, at the beginning of that pandemic, people who got HIV through blood transfusion were treated and regarded very differently than those people who may have acquired it through sexual contact.
Mm-hmm.
And so there is a differential in this country about how we treat illnesses that we believe could be prevented, but for your own behavior. And that's why you're in that situation. And there's less regard given to those illnesses that are put in that category versus those category of illnesses like communicable diseases that can be easily spread through just general contact with an individual, not necessarily sexual contact or intimate contact.
Mm-hmm.
And that is a philosophical perspective that we as a country have to address in order to get to what you're trying to get to, and that is the cost for a therapeutic that we know works that will save lives versus the cost for a vaccine that may be preventative
Mm-hmm.
and preserve life.
Yes. And I think it's interesting how, like you said, how things like with the HIV is that it, depending on how you contracted it, people will look at you as a careless person or a victim.
Right.
And I think that's very interesting because then when you look at in terms of like smoking, before when the science was allowed to come out, because the science was there, but when it was allowed to come out, before that, if people were smoking and then they ended up dying of lung cancer, people would look at it as like, oh, like that's something terrible, which it is terrible. But now since the science is out and people say like, oh, well, we know that smoking kills you. So now it's the shift kind of changed from the person being a victim of lung cancer than that person giving themselves lung cancer. And especially I think with type 2 diabetes, we do need to look at that because with the food that we eat, most people don't understand like the effects of the added sugar that is put into these foods. And with that, I actually started diving into that, looking at it. There's a professor, Dr. Robert Lustig. Yes. So he's an endocrinologist, and he looked at the effect of added sugars like fructose, fructose, high fructose corn syrup, things like that, in the effect on the liver. And he found that children are now having a condition called non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. And when you look at what children are eating, there's a lot of added sugar. So I think that when people will look at someone with type 2 diabetes, they'll just look at it as like, oh, you just eat too much. So like even with some people that are vegetarians, with the stuff that they're eating, if there's added sugar in it, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're healthy. So I think it's very interesting how with public health, when we associate something with behavior, it kind of takes that person out of the context of their environment. It makes that person like a silo. It's like, this is all your fault.
Absolutely. And I think that's problematic, not only for the illnesses that we described, but a lot of different illnesses, because people either don't have the requisite education or they don't have access to anything different to make a different choice. And, we always talk about, well, you should eat healthier, you should make a different decision. But we also know, having been here in the Black Belt of Alabama, that sometimes accessibility and acceptability are big issues in as to why people make the choices that they make as well. And so there are a lot of different factors, and I believe we have to take a look at the entire environment in context and before you start to blame individuals who have certain types of illnesses, and understand the context in which they live, work, and play before you can start to pass judgment, if you will. And also parse treatment. And, that's also another fundamental issue that the United States has to really come face to face with if they really want to address the excess deaths that happen amongst the poor and marginalized communities of the United States. Is that, when you put people in a situation where they have to make a decision between getting their medications that they need, or putting food on the table, or being able to feed their children something so they're not hungry, or feeding them a more healthy meal.
Yes.
And cost and price and accessibility are critical issues when you look at those issues.
Yes. And especially, and definitely when it comes to food and people that receive SNAP benefits, is that depending on where you're going, it is cheaper to buy that bag of chips or that frozen dinner or something like that, and so that your dollar can go a longer way versus eating something that is healthy. And I think that it's, like you said, it's wrong to place judgment on that person. It's like, oh, well, you should have bought stuff to make a salad. It's like, well, first of all, I'm working 2 jobs, still don't have enough money. That's why I'm receiving SNAP benefits. And like, how could you logically say to someone, pick this, but ignore everything else that led them to that decision? I think it's essentially an illusion of a choice.
Absolutely. And as a parent, you're also looking at what I'm going to feed my child to not only satiate them now, but keep them satiated so that I don't have to now look at preparing another meal in 3 hours.
And so I think we kind of veered off topic, but I wanted to go back to, with the vaccines and the individual choices, is that, do you think that a new vaccine technique should be mandated in terms of, because I know that with mRNA vaccines, they have been studying them for more than a decade. However, this is the first time that it has been disseminated out into the public.
So it's a question, do I think that vaccines that are new should be compulsory?
Yes.
Well, I think, and as I've said since the beginning of this pandemic, I think that we should not compel anyone to take a vaccination that has not received full FDA approval. That is the process in our country, regardless to what other use it might have had in the past. It should go through our full approval process that should not be truncated before it's compulsory. Especially when we take the position that if there's an adverse event, there's no way to actually make that person whole or to compensate them for any adverse reaction that they may have, so that if they lose time from work, or if they are, God forbid, somebody loses their life, the people that they leave behind that they were caring for are not able then are not able to sue the company in order to be made whole for that loss in income and relation that they are losing because of this compulsory vaccination. I do think that that is a flaw in our system, but I do believe in compulsory vaccinations. And we've done it again since the early 1900s. We do it for school-age kids for many different illnesses. Now, I do believe that we should be very intentional and consistent in studying how these vaccinations, not just COVID-19, but all vaccinations, MMR, smallpox, chickenpox, whatever vaccination, HPV, all the ones that are coming to the public should have gone through a clear approval process that is open and peer-reviewed, such that if there are issues, that they will be fully made aware to the public. And also that there should also always be a medical and or religious exemption that Jacobson v. Massachusetts sets out, so that for those individuals who, for their own individual reasons, for every individual person has a medical record. It's like your fingerprint that's individual to you. While you may inherit some things genetically from your parents that could be passed on through heredity, there are some things based upon the work environment that you're in, your health condition for whatever reason, that might make it not make it medically a problem for you to take that vaccination. So I think we have to allow for that, and for those allow people the mechanisms in which to understand those things. My concern with the compulsory vaccination is that many people, many Black and other people of color, don't have regular healthcare physicians. They don't necessarily know their health status. There are many people who walk around who are diabetic or pre-diabetic and have not been diagnosed, or who may have some allergic reaction, but because they have never received any health care, they do not know that they are allergic to certain things. And so for those people, I think it is very troubling because they don't have the same amount of access to medical care prior to compulsory vaccination to be able to make an informed decision about how they should move forward. I do think it's a very individual decision, and I believe in the exemptions, but also believe in compulsory vaccinations.
Okay, and I think that's there are a lot of things that you touched on that I want to get to, and one of them is that, like you said, is that there are a lot of Black people that don't have a primary care physician, and with people that I've spoken to, they've said it's like, okay, if I take this vaccine and something happens, I literally do not have the money. I cannot afford to be sick. I cannot afford to have something go wrong, because if I have to miss work or something like that, I'm going to lose my job. And I think that's something where it's like you said, that there are few protections just generally, not even in the context of vaccines, is that you want me to do this, but you want me to do this because it's going to help the community, but you have not set things up in a way in which I feel protected. So I've met a lot of people that said, like, if I had health insurance, I wouldn't worry that much about taking a vaccine, but I don't have health insurance. So these are the reasons why I'm holding out. They said maybe eventually when they get a job, or they kind of just let other people get vaccinated. I've heard a lot of people say, it's like, I'll let them go first. So that's definitely true. And another thing that you said was that not necessarily agreeing with a non-approved treatment, because the big thing is that a lot of the vaccines were getting emergency authorization use.
Yes.
And with that, just from media, just hearing people say it's like, oh, well, you need to go get it. And then when people would say like, well, it's not approved, it's only authorized. And people not understanding what that actually means. Would you be able to kind of explain to people what is the difference between emergency authorization use and actual FDA approval?
Right. So FDA approval usually has 4 stages, and a drug or therapy that actually gets emergency use authorization is usually in a state of emergency, right? So there has to be an emergency, which we all have clearly accept. There's a pandemic and there people are dying.
Some people have accepted it.
Yeah, well, you're right. Not everyone has accepted that we're in a pandemic. So for those who have accepted, that is part of the predicate that has to be laid for emergency use. It has to be a recognized emergency. And part of how you see evidence of that is the state of emergency that was declared by each and every governor within the United States. The state of emergency declared by the president and by the World Health Organization. So not just here in the United States, but around the world, this has been accepted as an emergency. So that's part of the predicate for getting an emergency use authorization. But you still have to have gone through at least a phase 1 and 2 of the FDA process. So it's not like you can just pull something off the shelf all willy-nilly and say, it's an emergency, let's use this. It has had some gone through 2 of the phases, which include some cohort studies of people who have been case control studies who have been exposed to the new therapy or in this case, the immunization. And they have some data that indicates that this would be have a positive impact in the community. It has not gone through the last phase. And I think we all have to accept that when a drug or therapy is in emergency use category, everyone that's taking it at that point is part of a phase 4 clinical trial. You are part of a clinical trial that they're still collecting data on to see, and that's why you have VAERS and where people can report adverse events, and why when there are a cluster of those, there's still rigorous investigation as to those adverse events to see if there needs to be any updates to the emergency use authorization. That's why we saw early on in the pandemic when Johnson & Johnson was out there, and then through the VAERS system, they saw all these adverse events starting to occur. It then got suspended until there could be some more studies conducted to see if this was actually causing more harm than good. So you always have those tenets of ethics that are being applied to any of that. And one of those, of course, is making sure that it is providing a benefit and that that benefit outweighs any potential harm that could come from the use of that emergency use therapeutic or immunization. Okay.
And then once right after the phase 4, they say that it's good, then that's when they get the stamp of approval.
That's what every drug that goes through the FDA process, that's drugs and cosmetics that are in use or for sale in the United States have gone through that same process. That is something that we have accepted and we've used time and time again. I think the part for me, and I promise you, I was a little hesitant at first because I have a K through 12 child. And so for her, I was a little bit concerned because I was like, well, those first trials were not in anyone under the age of 18. So you don't have any data on that. You're asking me to step out on faith now that she's going to react the same way. When we have plenty of things that are labeled for people who are 18 above and older or 15, but we have age limits on everything because there have been clinical trials that actually targeted those groups. And so, I understand how some of the hesitancy for some subpopulations when it comes to it, especially for children that are considered vulnerable and pregnant women, another vulnerable population. So it is, all those things have to also have a separate layer of investigation for those special population that is built into the approval process as well. And it is also a part of the the ethical tenets that we look at in healthcare.
Mhm. And like you said, is trying to figure out if it's doing more good than harm. And you mentioned, you said VERS. I can't remember what the acronym means right now. But could you explain what that is? Because I think a lot of times, especially with the hesitancy, people ask like, okay, if I get sick or something happens to me, or if I die, what are going to be the repercussions for like the compensation or the repercussions for the people that gave it to me?
So VAERS is an acronym. It is VAERS, and it stands for Vaccine Adverse Event Reporting System. And so it is a space where no matter who you are, you don't have to be a physician. You could be any person that has taken a vaccine and you had an adverse event, then you could go to that website, and I think it's vaers.gov, that you can go there and take a look and make a report. No, it's vaers.hhs.gov. I apologize.
Okay.
That is the website for the Vaccine Adverse Event Reporting System. And what you can do there is report any adverse event that you've had. But the other thing that you can do is you can look at the data that has been reported by other individuals for the vaccinations. And so you can look at how what type of adverse events have been reported for each of the different vaccines, and see how often they've been reported, what age groups they've been reported among, and all those different ways that you can stratify the data using CDC Wonder as the search tool to actually mine this data set. It can also be downloaded through a CSV file and sent to either SAS and or Excel for your own analysis of the data.
Okay. It's so that's to go to report if you had an adverse reaction and to kind of see if other people have had the same type of reactions. So I guess you have an adverse reaction, that reaction left you disabled or left you different, or in extreme cases, it killed you. What would be the legal avenue for the family member or yourself to actually get some type of compensation?
Well, for the COVID-19 vaccines, part of what the United States did in providing resource to the pharmaceutical companies was they actually indemnified them and agreed that they will be held harmless. So you do not have any legal form of going against the pharmaceutical companies, i.e. J&J, whichever company produced the vaccine that you took. The United States has indemnified them and agreed to hold them harmless for any adverse events because of the emergency status and the investment that the government made in asking them to move this product to the population as quickly as possible.
That I know some people are listening right now. It's like, well, how? So I guess I'll ask, do you think that that's a proper protocol to have? Because if you have something that we find out later on that was actually harming people, and this is a if that were harming people, and the government has already said it's like there's nothing that you can do about it, that kind of erodes away some of the trust that people have for medicine and science and medicine in general, and also with the government, because it's essentially saying I buy a car and the manufacturer isn't obligated to pay me damages if their brakes are faulty.
Well, it is not something that is new with these vaccines. It is something that has been in place for many, many years. It incentivize pharmaceutical companies to be involved in the creation and investigation of novel treatments and therapies, they are given this kind of qualified immunity so that they will not be held, their company and their shareholders will not be held financially responsible if it is later found down the road that this caused harm. Now, there is a process, it's the National Vaccine Injury Compensation Program that does allow for vaccine injuries to be compensated. And there, if you go to that website, it's a program that's ran through HRSA. And it is HRSA.gov/vaccine-compensation. And it will actually take you to a website that talks about the compensation program, what vaccines are covered, and also who can apply. Now, so there's a vaccine injury table, and the covered vaccines as of right now are diphtheria, hepatitis A and B, human papillomavirus or HPV, seasonal influenza, measles, mumps, meningococcal, polio, rubella, rotavirus, and a few others that are already enrolled in this program. Now, at some point, the vaccines for COVID-19 may also be enrolled in this program, but as of today, they are not. Mm-hmm. There is no method of compensation in which you can seek legal recovery against the manufacturers of the vaccine. Now, that does not prohibit someone from trying to go after an individual healthcare provider if they say, oh, when they jabbed me, they did something wrong or they did not mix it properly. But of course, you got to be able to prove causation and all the other legal things that you have to prove to be successful. Now, and I will say this, and I talked a little bit about this in our class. Anybody can sue anything for any reason. I'm not saying you can't sue.
It's a great American pastime.
You can sue anybody, anytime for anything. The question is there a theory of recovery that's available to you? Can you be successful with that lawsuit? Or are you just, having to exercise in the judicial system? That's the question.
And with that, if my legal jargon is correct, that's burden of proof, correct?
Yes.
Okay. So, hey, maybe I will go to law school. But okay, because when you read some of the ones that are covered, because I know some of them popped out. It's like these are vaccines that are mandatory. So I think it's interesting because I guess my question would be, so there must have been either a substantial amount of people or a reasonable body of work to show that there was causation between this vaccine and other ones. So I'm just wondering, are there people doing research to find better vaccines in place of these ones? So it's not, we're going to give you something that's mandatory. There's a likelihood that there could be an adverse reaction. We know this, it's established, but for you to play ball, you have to get these things. So I think it's very interesting that some of the mandatory vaccines are on there and not, well, the seasonal one is elective. So it's a mixture of them, but I just find it interesting that mandatory ones that were FDA approved are on there. And I think it's for people that burden of proof that threshold that you have to cross, like you said, is causation, which for some people that are listening that aren't in the scientific field, causation is one of the hardest things to prove because of so many confounding factors that someone can easily say is that, oh no, it wasn't the vaccine, it's the fact that you're overweight. It's like, now I have to show that it wasn't this. Like it's hard.
Yeah, it is. It's not an easy task, and one of the reasons why the National Vaccine Injury Compensation Program was established was to create a no-fault alternative to that traditional tort system, because we know causation is completely. It's not impossible. People do it, but it takes the biological plausibility, and for something that's new, that's hard to prove because it's new. That there's not enough scientific evidence that's available for you to be able to point to get past that, what we call a Daubert hearing, or basically that scientific evidence hearing that you have to put on in that causation part of the trial.
Mhm.
But this compensation program takes away that hurdle. You don't have to prove fault, and you don't have to go through and meet that burden of proof in order for you to be compensated under this program. But again, this program does not encompass all vaccine. It does not encompass the vaccines for COVID-19 as of today. And the main objectives were to ensure that there are adequate vaccine supplies, because on the flip side of that, if every pharmaceutical company got sued every time somebody had any type of adverse reaction in order for them to get their recovery, everything from a sore arm to, and you will be amazed what people sue over. So I know people may think like, nobody will sue over that. I promise you, I've seen more frivolous things get sued.
Yes, I have a couple of friends that are lawyers, and they've told me about things that they've seen. I was like, someone really claiming insurance for that? It's like, yes.
Yeah. You would be amazed. And so in order to keep costs down, because of course that cost get passed on to the consumer, if pharmaceutical company had to defend each one of these lawsuits, then the cost of vaccines go up. And so this is the compromise that they made with those pharmaceutical companies. So they'll stay in the business and be able to provide, have the ability to provide vaccines, not only for the United States, but around the world, and also to make sure that the cost doesn't become so exorbitant, as you were talking about with the insulin shots, where some people get priced out of the opportunity to participate because of the price that has gone up due to litigation. So those were some of the objectives around why they created the Vaccine Injury Compensation Program. And again, I think that eventually maybe these vaccines will end up on this list as well, because as you pointed out, many of the ones that are compulsory for school age kids are covered under this system. And that's mostly because for young kids who are vulnerable, they don't have enough medical record established for you to know that they may have some of those underlying conditions that might make it medically not indicated for them to take that vaccine yet. And so that's why this program was set up. Now, again, it's not an easy hurdle even just to get into this system. There are only certain people qualify. You have to have certain evidence in order to be able to be successful, but at least it's something that is there, that's available. And again, if you go to the website, you can see which vaccines are currently covered.
Okay. And I understand that I understand, not necessarily condone why that like pharmaceutical companies, they're looking out for their best interests. It's like, if I can sell 1 million plus doses of this vaccine, I don't want to be paying out, because with some injuries, you can pay out 6-7 figures to just one person. So I do understand that. I think it's interesting that I know that there are common side effects that they see within clinical trials. And I've asked some of my friends who have children, when they got their children vaccinated, were they told what these adverse reactions could be, what they look like, or were they even given a pamphlet? Sometimes you have to request it for you to even tell it. And I find that interesting because with smoking companies, they put a Surgeon General warning on it, so that at that point you can't necessarily really sue the tobacco companies because we told you what was going to happen. And I just find that interesting that pharmaceutical companies have not necessarily taken that that route.
Well, I wouldn't go so far as to say they have not taken that route, because again, it is on the end user, it's on those clinicians that are delivering those. Most people who get a vaccine don't ever see the container that it comes in. Then you see the shot,
Okay.
the needle. Many people never see the actual shipping container that came from the manufacturer. And that's where access to healthcare plays a critical role in this, because having a clinician that you trust, that will take the time to answer all of your questions or even raise issues for you to watch out for once you have received a certain vaccine, is an important piece in this story as well. Many times, especially when it comes down to things like vaccinations and therapeutics, yes, there might be a warning on the box container that goes to the physician's office, but it is then on that practitioner to convey that information to the actual end user, and so that they can make an educated decision about whether they want to delay vaccines and or to choose another option altogether. And so in rural spaces where there are not many physicians, where it takes weeks just to get an appointment with a physician, you can imagine that if you're taking your child in for immunization, it's taken you already 2 months to get that appointment in. And then they got so many people scheduled that they only spending about 5 minutes in the room with you. Unless you come on with all your questions, then that may never even get discussed. And that's if you feel empowered enough to question the physician. Because in many cultures, your physician knows best. They know everything. And so if you were supposed to know it, they would have told you. They didn't say anything about it. So you don't think that you have the authority to question them, but you do. And having advocates that can help people who don't feel empowered to do that is an important piece too. I was fortunate that in the fact that I studied biology in undergrad, so I have quite a few friends that are now physicians. So I've been lucky enough to be able to go to doctors and to take my child to a doctor of people that I know personally. And that makes a huge difference in how you relate to them. And so I think about that as I now engage with my mom and having to go physicians with her. She don't have a personal relationship with those individuals. And so having me like, put me on FaceTime. When they come in the room, let me talk to them. These are the questions I want to have answered, because if I ask her to ask the doctor, she'll either be like, oh, I forgot, or he didn't have time. And and it's more so because she doesn't feel empowered to question the doctor's opinion. And I think we have to, as Black people and other people of color, get that empowerment back, because there's plenty of data that supports the fact that we get treated differently when we go to the doctor. And so we have to
they don't believe us, or they don't listen to us.
Or even if they do believe us, they still may treat us differently than someone who does not look like us. You still may get a different treatment regimen just based upon the color of your skin. And that's scientifically proven.
Yes. And that's definitely, we definitely need to have advocates empowering people. And also on the physician side is that I've met some physicians is that they think a inquiry for knowledge is a affront to their authority. So it's like, wait, hold on, why am I taking this? Well, but like they'll get hostile. It's like, well, I went to medical school. What did you do? So I've met some physicians that they got thoroughly gassed up. Like their head is big.
Yeah, and I've experienced that too. And my response is always, well, I'm paying for your time right now through my insurer. And if you're not willing to service me, then don't bill my insurance.
Yes. Yeah. And I think that there is a part of personal responsibility where we do need to advocate for ourselves, but I think that it is ethically wrong that we live in a system where a person who you're going to for healthcare is not obligated to tell you all of these things that, like, I would think that's a form of malpractice if I'm not telling you what could happen.
And
all I'm telling you is the good things.
I absolutely agree with you. Or I'm only telling you about one potential treatment option. I've had the experience in dealing with fibroids where I was told the only treatment available to me was a complete hysterectomy. And because I'm in public health and because I have a good friend that's OBGYN, I know that that's not true. Mm-hmm. And so when I challenged her to say, are you sure that that is the only way that I can deal with the fibroid? She was emphatic. Yes, that is the only treatment that we have available for you. And I said, then clearly I'm in the wrong place. Mm-hmm. Because I know of at least 3 other therapies that could help my situation. But you're not willing to even have a conversation with me about them. You just want to get off me complete sterilization. How is that okay?
Well, I think it's because, like you said, that's the only option for you,
right? A
Black woman.
That's right.
And for those who don't know, is that, like, especially with Black women going to OBGYNs, is like the treatment and the treatment options are very different if you are a white woman going. Like, they will go above and beyond to save your uterus. But with a Black woman, it's, oh, you might have gotten a flat tire, let's torch the car. Like, so, so it's, to me, it kind of echoes the eugenics kind of Buck v. Bell case, but it's very apparent. And for those who aren't in public health or aren't OBGYNs or physicians that read, they'll just think that, oh, well, if a doctor were to tell you that, it's like, that's probably the best course of action. But yeah, we see the data.
Exactly. And knowledge is power. And, that's why I'm thankful for these kind of platforms that we have now more available. Not everybody's going to go to a webinar, or not everybody's going to get a degree in public health and have access to information, but everybody is on Twitter and on platforms where they can get information from people. And I just hope for everyone who might be listening to this, that you have a trusted source of information that you can go to, that when you have a question, that you can get it vetted. Now, please let me put a disclaimer on that. Everything that you hear on social media and on the internet is not true. There's a lot of misinformation on the internet, but the one thing that I found to be helpful, especially when dealing with physicians like I described, the one about the fibroids, is being armed with yourself. I had already researched the possible treatment, so I knew for myself that what she was telling me was not accurate. But the reason why I told her that I was never coming back to her again, was the fact that I know that she has probably told so many other women of color who sat in that same position, who did not have the information that I have, and they accepted what she said to be true. And she has sterilized them and kept them from the ability to have a child. Some women that I've actually spoken to in the Black Belt region who had, because of fibroids, received a total hysterectomy, never had kids before. And I just think that is absolutely sad and egregious.
So I think 48% of my listeners are women. So could you just say what are some of the other treatments for women that are dealing with fibroids?
Well, I'm gonna tell you, I will probably misname them and mispronounce them. Okay. But I can tell you that there are treatments where you can have the fibroids, you can cut off the blood supply to the fibroids through a laparoscopic. You don't have to be cut open. It can be done laparoscopically, and that is with a small, tiny incision and with computerized arms to go in and actually cut off blood supply to the fibroids, which will shrink them, which completely ridded me of my symptoms that were related to my fibroids, which were my concern. And so many people experience really heavy bleeding, really bad abdominal cramps associated with their fibroids around the time of their period, and just having them shrink by cutting off blood supply, and many of them will just die because of that. That is a method that can be used that preserves your uterus and preserves your ability to continue to have children. There are also other procedures that your OBGYN probably can explain in a much easier way. I know more about that one because that's the one that I chose, was to have the blood supply cut off to the fibroids so that they would die off on their own. But just the information that's currently available for women with fibroid, which women of color suffer for much more, they have a much higher prevalence of fibroids. And so my suggestion to you would be to do your research on treatment options before you go in and have your visit. And you have each one of those, whatever you need to print them out, you need to make a list and have them talk to you about the potentiality. I think a lot of reasons why OBGYNs do not refer you to these other options is because a hysterectomy is something that OBGYN can do themselves. That's something they can bill you for. That's something that will keep you in their practice. Many of these other procedures takes a specialist and requires them to refer you out to get that done. And so that's money leaving the practice. That does not make them money. And so it's also an economic reason behind some of those recommendations as well.
See, I did not know that. I know that doctors obviously get paid for the services, but I didn't know that an OBGYN could do that themselves. So that is part of it might also be racism, but that is also like part of the incentive for doing that. So, and I want to say to people, because I've been, even before I was in public health, I was always just vocal with my doctors. I was a headache for them because I asked questions, but I didn't care. Is that you have the authority to advocate for yourself, and always remember that whatever the doctor says to you, you don't have to do it right then and there. Give yourself some time to go back and look at other options, or if anything, get a second opinion.
That's very key. But unfortunately, in rural spaces where there's many times not a specialist, and if so, it may be one or two, getting a second opinion sometimes is not always so easy to come by, especially when your insurance may not necessarily pay for that second opinion, depending on the type of insurance that you have. But you should definitely explore. That's why I would say also knowing about some things before you go there so that you can challenge them in the moment. Like, if you're saying this is the only one, then what about this that I read about? What about this? Why can't I do this? And have them actually address it. And if they refuse to even discuss it with you, I would take it up with my insurer and be like, you know what, I went in, they refused to provide me the service. I don't think they should be reimbursed for this visit.
Yes.
Do that too. That gets their attention as well.
Yeah, because when you start taking food off the table, they at least start acting right. Hopefully, if you take your service away, hopefully that next person, you're helping them, because now that physician might listen to them and actually answer their questions. So I think that's part of also caring about your community, is that's one way that you can empower yourself, but also help the person that's coming after you.
Right, and there are also some national advocacy groups around most of the health outcomes that we've talked about, that if you actually go to their website, I know the National Medical Association is the association of Black and other people of color that are physicians, and they have opportunities where you can ask questions, or you can attend some of the seminars, or look at some of the information that they provide to the community to try to help fill some of those access gaps and provide fill in some of those knowledge gaps so that people are better armed and prepared to advocate for themselves. Okay.
I only have 2 more questions for you, and then I'll let you go. This one kind of has us, because we're both in public health, kind of holding up a mirror. because some of the things that I've seen, especially from public health officials, advocates, things like that, people within the sphere, is that for those individuals that were anti-vax, is that they tended to paint them with a very broad brush. Is that a lot of from the people that I've spoken to, they've spoken about them from an elitist type of standpoints, like, oh, well, these people are uneducated, they don't know anything. It's like it's like, no, because if you look at it, there are some physicians that were saying they don't want to get vaccinated. There were nurses that were saying that I don't want to get vaccinated. And then some of them were actually being fired for it. So the same people that you were praising, clapping as they were going to work, the first responders that you were holding up, they exercised their right, and then they're not uneducated, you then demonize them. So I just wanted to ask, like, what do you think that public health officials, professionals, people within public health, what can they do to actually address the unique concerns of people that are against vaccinations? Because there are people that are, yes, uneducated, the very far right people, the Trump people, we understand that. But then there are also highly educated people that have legitimate concerns.
Well, I think how you started is one of the things that we have to do is not paint everybody with such a broad brush. You know, you highlighted the fact that you have highly educated individuals who, for their own reasons, are against vaccinations. And, you know, I think many times when you sit down and have a conversation with individuals that are against vaccination for COVID-19 specifically, they vaccinated their kids for the other illnesses that we vaccinate for. So they're not an anti-vaxxer because they have received vaccines themselves and allowed their children to be vaccinated. But it was something about this particular vaccine that gives them pause. And I think part of that is because of the way it was rolled out under the previous administration, the messaging that was used at the start of the pandemic, and the flip-flopping from HHS and CDC that occurred in those early stages, that made a lot of very learned people be like, yeah, I don't know, because I don't know who to trust. So I think what we have to take away from this as public health professionals is the importance and the of having trusted health messages out there and being trustworthy in delivering health messages. So being okay with saying, I don't know. Sometimes that is the only and appropriate answer. But many times public health officials, we have a hard time saying, I don't know. We want to give an answer to the question. And when we turned out to find out 2 days later that that was the wrong answer, instead of falling on our sword and saying, I was wrong, this is the right answer, we will try to rationalize and convince you and ourselves that that first answer was right, in the face of evidence that's telling us that that answer was wrong. And so I think until we can be more authentic in our leadership and be willing to say, hey, I was wrong. But also I think the public has to understand that while public health is a science, it is also an art. We make information that you receive today is based upon information that they have available today. If they get new information tomorrow, especially when you're dealing with a novel illness, which coronavirus is, so we've never dealt with it before. So every day they're learning something new and something different about it. And I think the messaging around that from the beginning, if we had been a lot more transparent about the novelty of it and the fact that we don't have all the answers and that this is the best information that we have today. I think if we would have been a lot more transparent about that from the beginning, that the mistrust that then developed around it, it would be lessened. I think a lot of people now want to put the mistrust on the US public health Service study of untreated syphilis in the Negro male. And to be honest, there's actually studies that stipulate most people don't even know what really happened.
Yes.
Public health
Most people call it the Tuskegee experiment.
Right. And they don't even know the details. They don't
Yes.
even know what happened. If you start to query them about what happened, they don't know the details. They don't even know the facts. And so that is not why they have mistrust. There are other things that are tangible that they do know. And those are things like the conversation we just had about getting this misinformation from an OBGYN and then learning later that was complete.
That was wrong. Yes.
So the whole medical establishment in itself has some trust issues. And then again, the way this pandemic was handled from the beginning just actually helped to build that mistrust among people who are looking at the data. So if I see somebody standing in front of a podium and they're telling me A, and I'm reading the studies, because we have, these people that we're talking about that are educated, they're reading the studies with themselves and they're like, yeah, that's not true. So you can understand why they could have some hesitancy while they do understand that, yes, there is a pandemic. Yes, people are dying. But what they don't necessarily trust, and they do know that sometimes we don't always get all of the information that's available. And so you have to query that a little bit deeper than, oh, they're anti-vaxxers and they just are ignorant to the facts. They may have all of the facts, but because of their own historical reflections of things that they know have been put forth as facts and later found out to be misinformation, they may be taking a let's look and wait and see approach.
Yes. And I think that what I've noticed is that when those types of doctors do come out and be like, I'm hesitant about getting it, immediately people want to discredit them and be like, oh, they're a quack. They don't know what they're talking about. It's like they want to pull their entire resume and try to find a way to discredit them. It's like, but if that same doctor said everyone needs to get vaccinated, no one would have actually, it would have been a completely different reaction. And I think that when people try to use the USPHS syphilis study at Tuskegee as the means for it, I understand he says that most people don't even know the concrete details about what happened. I think people try to use that as an example of the mistreatment of Black people by the government. And I implore everyone to actually look up what happened, because I've heard some people say it's like, well, people shouldn't use this because this was the government withholding treatment, not giving treatment. So it's not the same thing. It's like, but it's not, for most people, it's not the concrete details of it. It is the government did something that was morally and ethically wrong. And they knew it, but because it was Black people, they thought that they were justified. So, and I think the ongoing thing is that the government in the medical field, I think time and time again, especially for Black people, have shown to not be a trustworthy institution.
I agree.
So I think it's kind of hard because when now I'm in public health trying to talk to people, and it's just like, oh, well, you're part of that now. So it's like you're
part of the establishment now.
Yes, I'm part of the, and people were shocked because as of right now, I'm still I'm not vaccinated, but I have not told anyone to not get vaccinated. I've also have not told anyone to get vaccinated. I have just presented them with facts like this is what it is. What is your exposure level or your risk level? Because for myself, I live by myself. My parents are up in Boston right now. So if they were to come back, I would go ahead and immediately get vaccinated because I understand that I would be going out more than they can and they can't get vaccinated. So I understand my exposure level, and I also take the proper precautions, the washing hands, mask, 6 feet, the things that we were told to do in the beginning that would have worked if people listened, right, and just stayed in the house. but those are the things that I do. And for me, when I looked at the data, the reason why I was hesitant about it is because it was essentially the same old thing of having Black people be underrepresented in these studies. Now, what they said is that, oh, well, it was the highest participation of Black people we've had in these COVID studies. The highest is not, doesn't meet the criteria.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, and that's what, that personally for me, what I've used, and just also with the messaging is that I was talking to one of my friends about it, and I probably should have asked which vaccine she got beforehand. But we were talking about the Pfizer vaccine, and the messaging behind the Pfizer vaccine was it's 98% effective. Okay, but that's the average. When they looked at people of Asian descent, it was 75% effective. She's Asian. She was never told that when she went there, so she thought she was walking around with 98% like protection when she wasn't. So I think it's a lot of the, like you said, the transparency and letting people know it's just like, hey, this is how it works. This is not the average. This is how it works for everybody. But I firmly do believe that when we trick ourselves into believing we live in a post-racial society, there's an unintended effect of that, is that there might be some differences that medically can affect someone. But because I want to be politically correct, if I say it to someone, then that person's deemed as a racist.
I can completely agree with all of that. And at the beginning, when it was still just emergency use authorization, that was just when people asked me that question, what do you think? Because, even though not a doctor, never tried to practice medicine, never even wanted to go to medical school, but because I'm in public health, people ask me, what do you think? Are you going to take the vaccine? Should I be vaccinated? And I implored them to do the same type of analysis. Is, you have to take into context all of the underlying health conditions that you suffer with. Then you also have to look at your risk profile. What is your job? How much exposure you're going to be exposed to other people? Because the one thing about a communicable disease is not just what you're doing, but if you have to be in a space where you have to engage with other people often, you have to also be concerned about how they are conducting their lives, because they put you at risk and they increase your risk profile. And so if you're able to be in a bubble, you live at home. Me and my daughter, when everyone was sent home at first, we were here for 6 months by ourselves. We only went out to the grocery store, right back home. And so at that point, I felt like my risk profile was low enough that I did not need to have the added risk of a vaccine that was still in emergency use, because I was not one of those persons that had to be out and about all the time. And I was doing all those other medication things that we ask folks to continue to do. But even once I knew my child had to go back to school, my position was, if she has to go back to school, I would prefer her to be vaccinated, because I know that younger kids are not going to do all these mitigation things. And if I'm going to have my child do it, I got to do it. I can't send her to be vaccinated and not be vaccinated myself.
Yes.
So that's how I got there. And I think for everyone, they have to go through that type of analysis for themselves and looking at their situation. Now that we're more so wide open again, we have to be concerned about not just our own bubble, but the people that we allow into our circle, even through a work engagement or having a friendly card game, or riding in the car, catching a ride with somebody, catching an Uber and a Lyft. You have to be concerned about what is the risk profile of your driver, because you're in that car and they're breathing that air. And then in the South, you're going to have that window rolled up with some air conditioning on. So you're not getting fresh air in there. So you're breathing air that they're breathing. So all those things you have to take in consideration. And then what is the best way that I can actually prevent from serious illness or death? And that is how I got into my analysis and led to me being vaccinated. And I think that everyone should be fully have the full autonomy to make that kind of analysis for themselves. However, when you work for people, having done employment law for over 15 years, if your employer sets a rule, if you want to have that job, then you need to comply with that rule, or you're being insubordinate and subject to firing. So those healthcare providers that got fired up in New York because they were unwilling to comply, I actually agree with that, because I feel like you don't have a property right in a job.
Yes.
You have your skills. Yes, you are in control of your person, but you don't get to control this business organization because it belongs to someone else. Now, if you want to be affiliated with that, then you got to follow that rule like you have to follow every other rule, like don't bring a handgun or don't smack anybody in the face while you're at work. All those things that we do as a part of society's rules, those things apply in a situation too. And it is interesting to me that the reaction to the infringement upon individual rights in this context is so intense when we accept infringement on our rights all the time, especially in employment situations. So that part of the analysis and the question about individual rights is a little problematic to me. So I feel like it's something else underneath that, because we accept those types of infringements on our individual rights all the time. I would prefer to wear a sweatshirt and sneakers every day. That's where I'm comfortable. But my job says that's not professional attire for my role. So I dress appropriately for the role. And that's a part of me giving up my individual right to wear what I want to wear, to actually be able to work in the environment that I choose to work in. So we all make concessions in order to do that. And for those people who quit other than comply, that is your right. But you should not be relying upon me or anyone else to financially support you to exercise your right.
And I think that's where people, because I do agree with, I agree with you, is that when they were fired, that they were in their rights to do so. You were also within your right to not get vaccinated. I'm also a big proponent of autonomy, but I'm also a big proponent of consequences.
Right.
Like if people listening to this probably listened to last season, I'm very big on people being able to say whatever they can, well, whatever they want. There will be sometimes consequences for it, depending on what was said. But that's the thing, is that if you want to be 100% safe, you can't also be 100% free. And if you want to be 100% free, you can't be 100% safe.
Absolutely.
So I think that we need to find a balance between the two. And like you said, is that it's interesting because people make concessions all the time, but it's this one that they're saying, it's like, well, I'm not going to concede that. And it's like, but were you vaccinated before? People can make the argument, I was in school, my parents had control over that. Have you gotten the flu shot since then? Yes. You've conceded. Like, so it's about I think it's about the merit of the argument, is that where does your contention come from? And is it from a sincere place? Or are you being loud for the sake of hearing yourself be loud?
And I think it's starting to be more of that kind of noise in this argument, in my opinion.
Yes.
Again, if you have a deeply held religious belief or personal belief, and you're willing to accept the consequences, most employers are allowing you to test weekly as an option, which I think is appropriate. So, but then how do you get mad at that? It's like, okay, you don't want to be vaccinated. Your option is to be tested weekly. Now you got a problem being tested weekly. So now you don't care if you actually infect other people. You just don't care about other people, in my opinion, in that scenario. Because I'm like, at what point, as we start talking about where does your individual rights infringe upon mine? You know, the people that have to work near you and the people that you are tasked to serve on your job have just as much right not to be made sick by you. Now, am I saying because you get vaccinated that you can't carry and spread vaccine? No, COVID, yes, you can. It's proven you can still transmit disease, virus, even though you've been fully vaccinated. So that's not the case. But also, it's also statistically proven that you won't get, that it protects you from being severely ill.
Yes.
And my contention or my problem with those individuals now is that our healthcare system is so inundated with caring for COVID patients, for people who are unvaccinated, that people who have other chronic illnesses and other accidents, they are not able to receive the same standard of care that they were able to receive prior to COVID, because the resources are just stretched so thin.
Mm-hmm.
And they have been prioritized different. And I think we're also seeing an increase in deaths from other illnesses because of the lack of availability of adequate health care to address those other concerns that need to be hospitalized as well. And I think that's something that those folks that are not willing to be vaccinated, I think that's part of the argument that they need to consider. It's not only about the individual. And being a part of the United States, going back to Jacobson v. versus Massachusetts, there is a point where the collective's right to be safe outweighs your individual right.
Yes. And the last thing I will say, and then the last question, because you ended it good, is that people need to think about is that, and smoking is a very versatile example for a lot of things. They put restrictions on where you can and cannot smoke because they understood that the smoke that people were exhaling off of their own personal behaviors were affecting people around them. So we've had instances where we have put the public health in front of people's individual choices. Now you can still smoke, but you just can't smoke inside. It's like you can choose not to get vaccinated, but you might not be able to work here, or you might not be able to, especially in New York. There are some places, I don't know if it's widespread, but I know that there are some places that you can't enter unless you have shown that you're vaccinated.
Right.
And like you said, is that people need to understand is that there is a likelihood that if you are vaccinated, that you can still transmit it. And I think people have been a little bit misled by social media. And I think part of it was public health not fully explaining what a vaccine actually does. Right. I think there are few vaccines that actually stop infection. It is supposed to make sure that you don't die from it. Right. It's supposed to lessen the symptoms. So people need to understand it's like, this is to keep you alive, not to keep you uninfected. Right. Unless you live in a bubble, it's like if you're around people that have COVID and you're vaccinated, you can still contract it, but it won't raise to the level of clinical symptoms. So you're not going to the hospital. But I wanted to just get your closing statements, if you have any closing statements, and just some possible solutions that people can do to address the tension between people's individual rights and the rights of the community and environment in which people are.
Well, I think in closing, what I'll say about that is, while at the beginning of this pandemic, the whole concept of herd immunity, and we won't go down that rabbit hole and start talking about what that means, because I think we actually missed that window because we have had so many different variants that we're going to have this as an endemic illness in our society going forward. It's also because of the globalization of things like food and travel and people having access to move in and out between so many different types of spaces that COVID-19 is going to have the opportunity to continue to transmit and replicate and mutate to escape vaccine and other treatments. So we're going to have this as a part of our lexicon like we do with influenza going forward. That's what I believe. Now, does that mean because we've missed the window to completely eradicate that people should just be like, oh, well, then no need for me to get vaccinated now? That's not what I'm saying. What I am saying is that we have to accept that mitigation for communicable diseases like influenza and COVID-19 and SARS and MERS and all the other things that have emerged, and other ones that will emerge because of the globalization of the world, and how the ability for animals and people to enter into habitats with individuals that they would have never been in contact with before transportation became so readily available to everyone. It's something that we're going to see. So we're going to continue to see, maybe not a COVID-19, but emerging illnesses that causes us to have to deal with a novel virus or novel bacteria or a novel disease, that we're going to have to go through this process again. And I really hope that the public health profession, as well as the whole medical field at large, will take the lessons that we should have learned from this and do a better job in how we communicate. And also in the interim of these new emergence, that we actually work on building trust and trustworthiness of health messages, so that when there is the time where we need to ask people to comply with public health mandates, that they know we're a trusted source where they can get trustworthy information. And I think that will move people to activation on mitigation strategies a lot quicker for things that might happen in the future.
Okay. So yeah, we need to do a better job. And I think that maybe in an ideal world, we wouldn't have to have mandatory vaccines, because people would trust, like, oh, what they say is true, and they do have my best interest in mind. Now that's.
But the establishment got some work to do there, because I don't blame people for the mistrust. Because we talked about examples of why it's here. And so I think as the profession, we have to do something. Yes. Stop pointing to other people and say, why don't you trust us? And ask the question of ourselves is, why am I not being trustworthy?
Yes.
And that's when we're going to see the systemic changes that will actually make a difference.
Yes. And those are the questions that we need to start asking. Well, I want to say thank you for choosing to sit down and talk with me. It's always good talking to you. I know that during while I was in class, like sometimes I would just come and just top by your office. I know you were busy, but you still talk to me. So thank you. I really do appreciate you coming and sitting down. And are there any type of plugs you want to tell people?
Well, I do want to say that we have received some resources from the Black Equity Center. And so we're actually going to start to do more things in social media. And I hope that we can come back to your platform as we start to roll out some of those things, and maybe even put an ad on your page to get to some of your followers to talk about some things around COVID-19 and mitigation and vaccine hesitancy. It is something we have to address again, and to really try to better understand trust and trustworthiness. And I will send you the link to our survey so that your listeners can fill it out and help us better understand how can we get better, more trusted messages in our community. So thank you, Ashanti, for what you're doing and for being out here on the front lines and having these conversations. I know they're not always easy to have, and I'll absolutely thank you for inviting me to sit down with you.
Oh, no problem. And if anybody listening found this very inspiring and like made you think about getting into public health, go get your MPH at Tuskegee University.
That's right.
That's where I got mine from, and that's why I'm able to talk the way I am now. So
please come see us. We actually may do some spring admits, so please go ahead and get your applications in, and we do have some support for tuition. So absolutely come check us out.
So everyone, that has been another episode of Tune Talks with the Pharaoh, and I will see you guys next week.